Hi, I'm Amy Cardoso and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Menil Collection, and our interviewer, Hollis Hammonds, speaks with curator Natalie Dupêcher about the exhibition, Meret Oppenheim, My Exhibition. Now for Art This Week.
Hi, we're at the Menil Collection to speak with curator Natalie Dupêcher about the current exhibit, Meret Oppenheim, My Exhibition. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Could you start by giving us an overview of the scope of the exhibition, like kind of the breadth and depth of the exhibition?
Yes, so this is the first transatlantic retrospective of the artist Meret Oppenheim and the first in the United States for about 25 years. So it really covers the full scope of her remarkable and remarkably long career. She made work from the early 1930s until right until her death in 1985, and so this retrospective covers the entire career. So it's a great way for visitors who might be familiar with one work of Oppenheim's or might be completely unfamiliar with her to really see the entire career in depth.
Another interesting component of the exhibit is the 1983 project called My Exhibition.
Yes.
I wondered if you could give us a little insight into the importance of this portfolio and I don't know how it relates to maybe the design of the exhibition as well.
Yes, so in 1983, as you said, Meret Oppenheim sat down in her studio in Paris and created a series of 12 drawings that she collectively titled My Exhibition. She would sometimes also refer to it as the imaginary exhibition, at one point called it the ideal exhibition. What it consists of is a meticulously hand-drawn overview of her entire career. So she created to-scale, very precise drawings of about 200 works that she had created from, again, the early 1930s right up until when she was making the drawings in 1983. She said that she created this project, the My Exhibition drawings, as a way to sort of counter what she referred to as the mixed-up character of shows, of retrospectives of her work that had been mounted in the past. So it was a way for her to sort of set the record straight. Importantly, though, she also wrote on the very first sheet of those drawings, this imaginary exhibition is only an example. I had to leave aside many works that for me are no less important. So she wasn't saying these are the best works I made, these are the most important, the most significant, my favorite works. She was simply offering one way to find a certain through line for her very long, 50-year-long career. And as you perhaps can tell, this retrospective that's co-organized between the Menil, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the Kunstmuseum Bern in Switzerland, our subtitle, My Exhibition, is taken from her title for that drawing project as a sort of nod to the very active role that she played in shaping the narrative of her own career.
It's so fascinating. I love this idea of her taking control of the narrative, and that comes up in a lot of writings about her work as well. And the catalog is excellent. I really appreciate that. I wondered if you could tell us more about Meret's affiliation with the Surrealists.
Yes, so this is how many people quite rightly know Meret Oppenheim as a Surrealist artist. In 1932, she left her home in Berlin to go to Paris. She was 18 years old, and she went with the ambition to become an artist. She was enrolled in art school, but found the classes boring, stopped going pretty quickly, and in the fall, she met the Swiss artist Alberto Giacometti in a cafe in Paris. Giacometti is an artist that is very closely affiliated with the Surrealist group, and so through him and through some other friendships she made, she very quickly found a path, really made a path for herself into that group. She was in 1933 then exhibiting with the Surrealists. She was signing Surrealist declarations. She was having her work reproduced in Surrealist journals. She was hanging out with these artists in the cafes in Paris. And so there's a real sense in 1933, 34, 35 of her really carving a path for herself and making these connections happen for herself. At that moment, Surrealism was, I think, a sort of big tent art movement that really was just the exciting, avant-garde, non-traditional art group at that moment. All of these artists had sort of different stylistic approaches to art making, but what united them was just this interest in making art differently and in being non-traditional and somewhat bombastic and unusual. And so I think Meret Oppenheim really gravitated towards that group of artists as just this sort of exciting thing for her to affiliate herself with as a young artist.
Yeah, that makes complete sense when you look at her body of work, and especially that early work. I wondered if there's a quintessential piece you think from this time period that is truly like in this world of Surrealism.
Yes, there are so many, but I think the real star of that gallery and a real significant work in the course of her career is a work that she titled Ma Gouvernante, My Nurse, Mein Kindermädchen. She makes it in the first few months of 1936, and she gives it this very interesting trilingual title. So it's not our translation of it, but it's something that she assigned to that work. And what it consists of is a pair of white high-heeled shoes that she tied together with kitchen string. She trussed it like a chicken and then placed it on a silver platter. And she has covered the heels of the white pumps with these white little frills. So it is meant to look, and does look, like a trussed chicken. It's a very funny work, and that humor is quite emblematic of her work, not only in the Surrealist years, but also a real through line of her entire career. She has this great sort of witty, somewhat subversive sense of humor that we see all the way up until the 80s. But My Nurse, the shoes work, is really emblematic too of her facility with objects and the way that she could take very familiar, very quotidian, everyday things, do something to them and transform them completely, make them completely different and unusual and unfamiliar to us. The work is a commentary in many ways on the strictures of femininity, which is something that Oppenheim, as a young female artist in a predominantly male artistic circle, something she was very keenly attuned to and would be interested in for many, many years. And it is, I think, one of the most significant works that she makes in that context.
It's so interesting.
It's such a funny, it's such a great work, and I think it, many of her works, even the ones that she makes in 36 like that, still retain their capacity to sort of shock or disturb and amuse, which has been a real delightful thing for me to see in this exhibition. I've been living with and thinking about her work for a number of years now. And so it's great when people come through the show and they really have a quite visceral reaction to it. And I think that's another, signal of how her work is still so powerful.
Thinking about that, about the materiality, about how she was using found objects, but she's also making drawings and paintings, and is there a a change in her work before, during, or after World War II in relationship to like material and technique?
I think that one thing that is quite significant in Oppenheim's career as we look at the fullness of it, the full 50 years, is that she was always experimental, and really throughout her career was trying out new ways of making art in dialogue with different artistic movements, new styles, new materials, and that she really wanted her work to stay quite fresh. And that's something that, since there hasn't been a full retrospective of her work in so long in this country, I think is has come as a real discovery or surprise to many people. One thing that happens in the right around World War II is that she leaves Paris and goes back to Switzerland. So that's an important change in context that happens for her. She's been in Paris for about 5 years, from 32 to around early 1937. She's made this work in dialogue with the Surrealists. She's really forged a path for herself. And then in 37, she goes back to Basel and enrolls in art school for the first time. So that's the second gallery of the exhibition, is devoted to the war years, essentially, from the quite late 30s to the around mid-1940s. It's in Basel that she actually goes to art school and takes art classes for the first time. I had mentioned that she had been enrolled in an academy in Paris, but really quickly abandoned those academic pursuits. In Basel, she's actually going to classes. She learns how to apply varnishes. She takes classes in color theory, in anatomy, and so there is a quite marked change that happens in her paintings in those years. They become quite illusionistic. She's really doing narrative compositions, scenes with figures in them, which is quite different from what she had been doing previously. Later after the war, in the later 50s, 60s, and 70s, she will mostly leave that sort of style behind and push into different ways of exploring abstraction, exploring assemblage, unconventional methods of object making. But one thing that remains sort of consistent or remains a through line is this interest that she's had in transformation and in experimentation. Those are the real sort of two pillars of her work in the 30s, this interest in unusual materials and this interest in transforming them into something totally new. Those two ideas are really central to her work from the 30s to the 80s, even as the artwork itself looks really quite different from one decade or one year to the next.
And the room that we're in is really the post-World War II room, right? The beginning of that.
Yes, this is the moment of her reemergence in a way. So after World War II, in the later 40s and early 1950s, Oppenheim experiences what she will later describe as a kind of crisis, in which she doesn't make a lot of work. She destroys some of her earlier work, and it's generally a sort of low period of creativity for her. She writes that in 1954, quite suddenly, she starts making work again. She feels inspired again. She takes a studio and she begins making objects again quite significantly. So this gallery that we're in now is that real moment of sort of reawakening and reconnection with object making in particular.
Yeah, and it does have a level of excitement when you go from the room that's mostly two-dimensional painting and representational work to this three-dimensional work that's, again, in different media. It's really exciting.
Yeah, I'm glad that translates for you. She is, I think, really, testing out new ways of making art. There's a real, I think, in these works, a palpable sense of pushing herself. There's a number of works that you can see next to me that she makes based on found picture frames, that she would insert these pieces of plaster into that reference the body in grotesque or delicate or sort of sexual, subversive ways. In many ways, she's anticipating an interest of that later artists would take in the female body. If we think of feminist art in the 1970s, she's doing this already in the late 50s and early 60s. She's also living in Bern at that moment, in the capital of Switzerland. So she moves from Basel to Bern, and Bern in the 50s has a quite active art scene as well. So she's becoming friends with artists that would be part of the Nouveau Realiste group, people like Jean Tinguely, Daniel Spoerry. And so she's in a new sort of contemporary context and is, I think really sort of excited to find herself inspired and productive all over again.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about, there's several themes that seem to run through her whole body of work, but one in particular that stood out to me was the theme of the heroine Genevieve. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that, like early to later works and how that imagery changed.
Yes, so Genevieve is, as you said, a figure that Oppenheim was interested in for many, many years. The earliest engagement with this heroine comes in the late 1930s, and I should say that the figure she's thinking of is Genevieve of Brabant, who was a French queen who was unjustly accused of adultery and exiled to live in the forest for many years. Oppenheim had, when she made her first Genevieve painting, she was also experiencing a kind of exile, I think. She had been in very cosmopolitan, avant-garde Paris, and then for a number of reasons had been forced to go to comparatively provincial Basel. And I think she identified with the figure of Genevieve in some way, identified with this figure who has to leave the life that she has made for herself and go to the forest and live in the proverbial forest. And when she first makes her first painting of Genevieve, it is a representational sort of narrative scene that has a woman floating above a kind of Swiss mountainous landscape with her hair cascading all around her. In the 1950s, she will make a number of Genevieve paintings that are, as you said, quite different. So these paintings have lost the narrative thread entirely. They are just abstract shapes that, in one example, in one case, hover above a sort of ocean expanse, and in the other case, it's a sort of oblong diamond-like shape that is portrayed against a blue background. So we're totally out of the realm of storytelling that we had been in the earlier moment. And it shows how, and this happens many times in her career, that she will maintain an interest in an idea or a figure or a theme, but it will undergo many different lives. And I think Genevieve is, as you say, one really specific, concentrated way in which we can see the persistence of a certain theme, but how she rendered it in totally different ways that really goes along with how experimental she always was.
Is there a work in the exhibition that you just want to talk about that's important to you, or maybe it's something that helped inspire you working on this exhibition?
Well, there are so many. I think that one work that, since we were talking about Genevieve, I'll mention one work from the 60s that illustrates this idea that I was just talking about the persistence of themes even as they take on very different appearances. And that is a painting from 1967 called Forest Interior with Dryads. In the 30s and 40s, when Oppenheim is in Basel making paintings, going to art school, she is often mining traditional stories for inspiration. She's turning to fairy tales, familiar stories, folklore. Genevieve is one example of that. She also makes a painting called The Earl Queen, which is her take on the legend of the Earl King, which in German folklore is an elf that punishes children who have stayed in the forest for too long. So we have a forest interior, we have woodland creatures like elves and other sorts of spirits in that quite narrative scene. In 1967, with the painting Forest Interior with Dryads, we have still the idea of the forest interior, we have these woodland characters, but it's totally abstract again. It's a sort of striped composition to which Oppenheim has affixed these silver-plated plaster forms and a real piece of tree, like a very crusty looking branch. So it shows how this interest in nature, an interest in enchantment and fairy tales, again, stays with her, but undergoes many, many different guises. And in the 1970s, that's the real sort of story of that very productive decade for her, is that these interests in abstraction, in nature and enchantment get overlaid with one another and really sort of supercharged in a way, and it becomes a really, really productive decade for her.
I just want to say that that was my favorite work.
Oh, I'm so glad.
So it's surprising that you chose that one to speak about. We didn't plan that, but I really love that work.
It's a really fabulous work in person.
It's very contemporary, and it leads me to this question about the relevance of this exhibition today. You know, I feel that the work was obviously relevant during her lifetime, although sometimes challenged. But what do you think is the importance of this exhibition at this location in 2022?
Yes, I think that for many years, art history regarded Oppenheim's career and its incredible diversity and multiplicity as a sort of somewhat strange phenomenon. She doesn't have a single style that she pursues over the course of many years. She is experimenting with assemblage, with sculptures, with drawings, with paper collage. She's sort of making whatever comes to mind at a given moment and not really trying to present a single story. And I think for many years that was seen as somewhat difficult to understand. But with the benefit of time and hindsight, I think there's this new moment in which we can appreciate Oppenheim's diversity, her incredible creativity, her wild imagination as a real significant contribution to narratives of 20th century art. And we can see how she really is a figure who bridges much of those 50 years in which she was making art, and how she, even though she might be best known as a surrealist, that she really is also a resolutely post-war artist who made art in dialogue with post-war art movements like pop art, like Nouveau Realism. And I think we're at a moment when we can really perceive that contribution in an exciting new way. And the other thing I'll say about Oppenheim, remarkable about her that we already touched on, is the degree to which she was involved in shaping narratives about her own career, about her own life, about her own art. She already in the early 1960s began to create a catalogue raisonné of her work, so a compendium of all the artworks that she had made to that point, and she would of course continue to add to that list as she went on to make art for a couple more decades. She was, as we mentioned with the My Exhibition project, very involved in crafting narratives of how her work was received, right? She was very involved with installing her own art exhibitions. And I think that too feels like a very sort of contemporary way of engaging with one's own art making, that she isn't just making things and putting them out into the world, or she is doing that, but she's also sort of in the moment thinking about legacy and about narrative and about how to shape her own story.
I am super excited that we were able to come and speak with you, and I agree that this is such a wonderful exhibition to be on display now, and all of those characteristics that you brought up about Oppenheim and how really she is equally a contemporary artist beyond surrealism, which is what we identify with her.
Yes, exactly. And I think that I'm really delighted, of course, that this show is on view at the Menil. Her surrealist origins, of course, has a great connection with our amazing, significant collection of surrealist works. So that is a wonderful context for her to be in. But I hope that people, when they come to the show, will see that many of the works she made in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s also resonate with artists they may know from our post-war galleries too. So I'm really happy that this can be a sort of way of showing the fullness of her career at the Menil Collection specifically.
We want to thank Natalie for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to menil.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching. Find all of our videos and sign up for our newsletter at artthisweek.com. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.